Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this first episode of the podcast, of the book club podcast called Chee-Tash. Chee-Tash comes from a word, Chee-Tash, from Macedonian, Serbian, meaning reading, or you read. And I felt like that was appropriate for this podcast. This is going to be a little bit different than other kind of book summary podcasts. I know a lot of YouTubers, a lot of podcasters do a good job of summarizing a book, and they summarize a whole book. You know, some books are shorter, longer than others. They'll summarize the whole book in a 10-minute video. They do a good job of it. They got great animations. They got great points. I want to break it down even further, though. Break it down even further. Because it's hard to gather the entire gist of a book in only like a 10-minute, even a 20-minute video sometimes. I would like to go page by page almost, chapter by chapter, and breaking it down. If you think back to high school when you read a book, teacher assigns a book to read, and they assign chapters 1 through 3. You got to get them done by Friday. Come in Friday, we're going to have discussions, questions, an activity, and then you move on. Okay, next we assign chapters 4 through 5. 4 is kind of long, so we're only doing 2 chapters, and you got to read that by Tuesday. That's going to be kind of the format for this. And I really just want to do a deep dive and get as much detail out of this book. In the first book that we're doing here, as you can see on the screen, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. Some of you may have heard of this book before, but it's a book about one man's journey through a concentration camp and kind of what he learned during that time. It's a heavy book, and we're going to go through pages 1 through 30 here, but it's a very, very heavy book. And it's going to make you think about your life and the issues that you come across in your life. And you're going to want to compare. And that's just human nature. You're going to want to compare. I was doing it too. I was thinking, you know what this guy went through and what I kind of complain about during my life, it doesn't even compare. And I think that's normal. I think that's normal. Comparing is something we do in our lives. We always compare ourselves to other people. I think that's a very normal thing to do. But it can get us in trouble sometimes, that's for sure. I think I'm diving a little bit away from the subject matter. Let's dive right into it. Man's Search for Meaning. And we're actually not going to start right at chapter 1. We're going to start at there's a foreword and a preface that I wanted to just touch base on really quick. A foreword written by Harold Kushner, who was a rabbi according to the little end script of the foreword. He a rabbi emeritus at the Temple Israel in Natick, and then he wrote a best-selling book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And there's a couple points that Harold Kushner talks about. For one thing, there was a Nietzsche quote that he talks about right there on page IX. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. So this was Kushner, and I'm gonna butcher. I'm gonna butcher Friedrich Nietzsche's name here. In what was it again? He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. And I thought that's a quote that poignantly explains what we are going to be going through in this book. This is like the overarching theme of this book, and I think Nietzsche summarized it quite nicely in this. Another thing he talks about, and this is to go along with the Nietzsche quote, is life is not about a quest for pleasure or power, but for meaning. All right. So it's not about power. It's not about pleasure. It's about meaning. And this is kind of what, from what I've seen so far, Victor talks about logotherapy and, the title of the book, Man's Search for Meaning. That's kind of what logotherapy about, is finding meaning in your life. And Kushner says there's three sources of this. There's work, there's love, and there's courage. So work, obviously, like your profession. Love can be like caring, or your relationship with somebody else gives you meaning. Or the courage, maybe to know that you are doing something you know that is right. Last thing I'll talk about Harold Kushner, and then we'll move on, is he was saying how, and we're going to see this in these first pages, how much they took away from the prisoners. They immediately took their clothes, they take their belongings, shave them down. They don't own anything. Almost all of their clothes they had to exchange for other clothes. They didn't have their hair anymore, and any part of their body, according to Viktor Frankl. But the one thing they could not take away from these prisoners, the one thing they could not take away, how you responded to this situation. That they could never take away. That was your choice, how you responded to the situation. And I thought that was very poignant that Kushner was talking about that. And then we have a preface here, which we'll just touch briefly. The preface was written by Victor. And this is in this book, the edition that I have. I think it's the 2006 edition. This is the preface to the 1992 edition. It starts off. And Victor has one really, really interesting story that he tells, because he actually had a chance to actually leave Austria before the Germans occupied it. He had a chance to leave. One interesting thing is before we get to that story, is that he wanted to publish it anonymously. He wanted to publish the book anonymously, and he kind of goes into why somebody tells him, like a reporter tells him, why did you want to publish it? Or excuse me, a reporter asked him about the success of the book. And he kind of says, like, well, you know what? The success of the book I could kind of care less about, really. He says right here, in the first place, I do not at all see in the bestseller status of my book an achievement and accomplishment on my part, but rather an expression of the misery of our time. So he's saying, why is everybody buying? Why Why is this book successful? Why are people buying this book? It says here right on the front cover, at least of my edition, more than 12 million copies in print worldwide. Why are people so interested in this? Is it because that people are desperate to find meaning in their lives? Very possibly. Very possible. And then he goes on to say that upon strong urging from friends, he ended up putting his name on it. But I wonder what the success of the book would have been like if he had published it anonymous. And that's actually a question that I'm going to pose for the audience. Why would consider publishing anonymously? The story that Victor talks about here, and then we're going to get into the first chapter. Here's the story in a nutshell, is that he had a chance to leave Vienna. He says, I received an invitation to come to the American consulate in Vienna to pick up my immigration visa. His parents were overjoyed, but then he had a hesitation because he didn't want to leave his parents to face their fate of the occupation of Germany and what would soon entail. He was looking for, quote, a hint from heaven. And he got one. His father had went to a synagogue where the National Socialists had burned down. And he had taken from it the piece, a marble piece, that was part of the tablets that the 10 Commandments were inscribed on. So a piece of that, and engraved on that piece was a letter that stood for one of the commandments. Victor asked his father, which one is it? And then he answered Victor, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. At that moment, I decided to stay with my father and my mother. Wow. Think about that for a second. He chose to stay. He had a chance to renew his visa and to leave the country. He chose to stay and, according to this quote, honor his father and mother. Wow. With that being said, let's go right into chapter 1, experiences in a concentration camp. There's only 2 chapters in this book, actually. There's only 2 chapters in this book. The first one dealing with the experiences, and then the next one dealing with logotherapy in a nutshell, and from what I understand, a deeper dive into that. And Victor starts off saying that this book does not claim to be an account of facts. So that's very interesting, and it's interesting that he talks about that right away. He brings that out right in the beginning. The fact that it's not an account of facts. Why do you think he starts off the book like this? Why do you think? I kind of think that possibly he's saying that there are other books that aim to achieve this. He's got a specific goal with this book. He's got to give you a little bit of a backdrop. He's going to share with you the experiences first, and then later tell you what he learned from it. I think that's why he says it, because it's not the goal of this book. If you want that, there are other books that aim to do that sort of thing. But this book is focused on an entirely different thing. He goes on right here, page 3, that most of the events described here did not take place in the large and famous camps, but in the smaller ones, where most of the real extermination took place. And you kind of think like, well, maybe the large famous ones were the ones that were kept an eye on the most, maybe by other foreign countries. Yes, they had the name to it, but the ones that you didn't know about, those are the ones where the true atrocities took place. Because nobody really asked about it. Nobody really knew. I don't know if I should say nobody cared, but just nobody knew. It wasn't in the radar. It wasn't in the spotlight. Here in page 3, we're introduced to a first kind of vocabulary word, capos. And from what he describes, capos were prisoners who acted as trustees having special privileges or well-known prisoners. So the capos were kind of like prisoners who the Nazis picked out to do the dirty work for them. I mean, in a way, right? And I just think like and he goes on to say here at the end of page 3, they almost treated the prisoners worse than the Nazis did, in a way. And I'm going to pose that question here. And I do have another question, but we might get to it a little later. Yeah, why would they treat them worse than the Nazis? The capos actually fared a lot better than all the other prisoners, because they were given the special privileges. They were maybe given a little more food. They just looked, I think he describes in here how much they looked better. And in some ways, they fared better in that role as a capo than they did in their regular life. Think about that. Think about maybe, was their life given meaning by being assigned this role in this camp during this time? Whereas outside of in real life, they didn't really have that. Something to consider. So he talks about being transported, and page 4. Talks about being transported. On page 4, transportation was not a good thing. According to Victor, transportation, if you were being transported, there's a good chance that you were being transported, he says, to your final destination. To your final destination. So he talks about how, you know, when they were on this train, tons of them packed in there, and then they, for the first time, see a sign. Somebody points out that they saw a sign, Auschwitz, that said Auschwitz on it, and everybody's like heart skipped a beat. that initial shock, like, oh my gosh, this is what's happening right now. This is going to be my life right now. Now, they didn't end up going to Auschwitz. We're going to see that in a second. But that's that initial shock. And you did not want to be in a train. You wanted to, what we're going to find out is you wanted to be working on a project or hired by one of the firms that hired the prisoners to work for them. You wanted to be doing that because anywhere else, you were on almost a one-way ticket to a gas chamber or a crematorium. Let's continue on. Let's go to page 5. Victor talks about how upon admission into the camp, everything was taken from them, and each prisoner had an opportunity to claim a fictitious name or profession. And for various reasons, many did this. This is also where they were assigned a number. You were no longer looked at as a name. You were a number. And I think we'll get into here. Victor's number was like 119104. And he says here, page 5, every man was controlled by one thought only, to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home, and to save his friends. Wow. Let's continue on to page 6. This is where he talks about the number that he was assigned. He talks about almost writing the book with using his number instead of using his actual name. So think about that. He wanted to publish it anonymously. Then he wanted to use his prison number. Then he just ended up using his name. So I wonder what was going through his head to go from anonymous to, hey, I want to publish this saying that it was authored by me as my prison number, to let you know that, hey, I really did this. I was really here. This is what life was like. We weren't even humans anymore. We were just a number at that point. I wonder what was going through his mind during that time. On page 7, we're introduced to what mainly he was doing in the camp. So he was mainly laboring. He says that he was not a doctor, even though I believe before the camp he was a doctor. He actually, yes, he explains how he helped out in the hospitals, oftentimes for no pay, helping out the poor. But in the camp, they did have doctors. And I believe some of the prisoners were assigned as doctors. Some of the prisoners were assigned as first aid posts. He does say that on page 7. But this was not him. He was charged with laying railway tracks. That involved a lot of digging. We'll see that later on. This is where you really go on to see right now about the living situation. So this is where we're introduced to premium coupons. These were issued by the construction firm to which We were practically sold as slaves. The firm paid the camp authorities a fixed price per day per prisoner. Coupons cost the firm 50 pfennigs each and would be exchanged for 6 cigarettes. So they barely got paid at all. Barely got paid at all. They barely got any food at all. So that's why he was saying, so these coupons could be exchanged for cigarettes, but as you'll see, page 8, they often took the cigarettes and exchanged that for food. Because, and here's one thing we'll write down here. Nobody smoked. Even though you did have access to cigarettes, nobody smoked. That was pretty much only for the capos, as he's going to explain. The capos had that privilege to smoke. Anybody else who they saw smoking or drinking, those were people that had kind of cashed out and said, hey, I'd rather just take the smoke, numb the pain, get that little nicotine high, than just feeding my body this food that's not even fulfilling. It's like it's maybe bread, maybe some cheese, barely any meat. You're not getting enough protein, I'm assuming. Maybe some honey jelly, he goes on to say later. But why am I just keeping on this life of just as little sustainment? I've been reduced to the most primitive form that a man can be reduced to. I'm just going to get this little buzz and then I give up almost. And that's what he says here on page 8. When we saw a comrade smoking, we knew he had given up faith and strength to carry on. It was a sign that you had given up faith. Page 8 and 9, this is where we also see that Victor talks about the 3 phases of an inmate's mental reactions. The 3 phases, and the 3 phases are: the first phase, following his admission, so right after admission. The second phase, when you're well entrenched in the camp life. And the third phase is the liberation. So I'll type this out for you guys here. Following mission, entrenched, liberation. The characteristic that describes the first phase, the symptom that he says, is shock. And under certain conditions, shock may even precede the prisoner's formal admission to the camp, he goes on to say. This is where he tells the story of being in the train several days and nights, people just packed in there. They could barely open up the window. Only the top parts of the windows were free to let in the gray of dawn. Everyone expected the train to head for some munitions factory, but one guy cries out, "There is a sign, Auschwitz," and everyone's heart missed a beat at that moment. This is on page 9, that first paragraph. And then later on, see, the train goes past Auschwitz. They go to another camp, and he describes that camp on the second paragraph on page 9. Immense camp became visible. Several rows of barbed wire. I'm paraphrasing here. Watchtowers, searchlights, ragged human figures, gray in the grayness of dawn. isolated shouts, gallows with people dangling on them. That's that initial shock that he is talking about. Let's continue on, going on to page 10. Here in page 10, we're introduced to another word here, or phrase, delusion of reprieve. Delusion of reprieve. He explains that this is the condemned man immediately before his execution gets the illusion that he might be reprieved at the very last minute. And I can only imagine that this is what a lot of these people are feeling right now. They have that initial shock, and it's almost like they still don't really believe that they're in the camp. They don't believe that this is going to be their reality for who knows how long. So they believe that they still have a chance to get out of it, or that maybe it's not real. They're going to be freed. Everything's going to be okay. He says here, we too clung to the shreds of hope and believed to the last moment that it would not be so bad. I wonder if this is something that everybody faced, or do you think that there were some people that did not have delusions of reprieve, that knew, like, hey, this is it. Like, we are going to die here. Or do you think it depends on maybe how they were living before? If their lives had meaning before, outside of this, maybe that's how they carried in that hope into the camp. Possibly. Page 11 is also, this is where, I think I mentioned this earlier, when we were talking about the cigarettes, alcohol was used in the same way. When they kind of saw people drinking alcohol, they knew that, well, they were trying to numb the pain. They were trying to dope themselves, he says. So nearly everyone in our transport, he says, lived under the illusion that we would be reprieved. Okay, so I guess that kind of answers my question right there. Nearly everyone in the transport. This is where he talks about first falling into two lines. So they were separated. Luggage was left on the train. Women on one side, men on the other. And this was, he says, continuing on page 12, it was the first selection, the first verdict made on our existence or non-existence. You did not want to go to the left. You did not want to go to the left. Left was where he said if you didn't look fit enough to work, you were just automatically sent to the crematoriums. If you did look fit enough to work, they would put you over in the right side of the line. And he was put on the right side of the line. I wonder if they know. I wonder if you know, if you're just looking at the people that are in your line, if you know that you survived or not. So if you look in your line and you see there's a lot of sick people, injured people, elderly, what have you, in one line, is the writing on the wall at that point? Do you know what's going on? I don't know if they really knew what was going on, why they were being split up. There's this chilling account here where they're talking about they had somebody he knew, he was sent to the left side. And somebody told him, then you can see him there, I was told. And where? A hand pointed to a chimney a few hundred yards off, which was sending a column of flame up in the gray sky of Poland, dissolved into a sinister cloud of smoke. That's where your friend is, floating up to heaven. Chilling. This was something kind of to answer my question a little bit earlier. Even if you were sent to that line, I don't think you really knew where you were going, what was going to happen. So he was saying that even when you got to the crematorium, there was these bath signs written in those rooms. So you would think that you were taking a bath, and then all of a sudden, you know, your life is over, and you wouldn't even know it. Wow. Continues on page 13. They had jewelry, watches. SS guards tried to get those watches from them, so they were nice to them so that the prisoners would then give up their prized possessions, their watches, and then they would not return the favor. I think that's why some of the prisoners gave them those prized possessions, was because they thought that they would return the favor later on, but I don't believe they ever did. I don't believe so. Let's continue on. Page 14. Victor talks about how he didn't really understand that everything would be taken. Nothing, you would have nothing. But he was trying to save a book, a manuscript, he says, and he was asking somebody about it. He desperately wanted to save it. He didn't want to give it up. And he was asking somebody about, do you understand that? Like, kind of like, how can I save it? What can I do? And the guy he's talking to grinned, a piteous grin, then more amused. Then he yells, shit. Excuse my language, but that is what it says in the book. And here's the truth, and he says, I saw the plain truth and did what marked the culminating point of the first phase of my psychological reaction. I struck out my whole former life. This is where he sees that they're not saving anything. Nothing is coming with them, not even this manuscript. The Nazis don't care how important it is to you. You're not keeping it. So why did this guard yell shit? Well, because there was a soldier, an SS man, and this was kind of something I wanted to ask, because I've seen there's been different words used to describe what I think are the same thing, but they might be different. So he's going to mention things about SS men. He's going to mention things about Nazis. His dad mentions the synagogue that was burned by the National Socialists. And this is a question I wanted to pose. What's the difference between all these? So this guy comes and basically tells them, hey, you are to strip down, fully undress, drop everything. You have 2 minutes. He's starting the count now. People were whipped. Nobody could take anything. They were shaved to where they barely recognized each other. Had to take showers. And he says something on page 15. We possessed literally, all we possessed literally was our naked existence. What else remained for us as a material link with our former lives? For me, there was my glasses and my belt. And he says he ended up giving up trading the belt for some bread. So they literally had nothing. Not even the hair on their bodies. And this is, there's an interesting link between not having hair. Remember, there was a story in the Bible, Samson, who had had hair that was his power. His power stemmed from his hair, and then he cut off his hair and he lost all his power. I wonder if that's the reason why they are shaving them down. Maybe to dehumanize them, make them look all alike, and yeah, sure, maybe to prevent ticks, bugs from spreading and things of that nature, yes. But I wonder if this had something to do with it, this story of a hair being a form of power, being a form of identity, and they lost their identity. They lost their possessions. They're dehumanizing them, making them sink to a point, regress to a primitive point, which we'll talk about later. So let's continue. Page 16. So they were given other clothes. Remember, they could not take any other clothes. I think they took their belts. Victor had his glasses. They were given other clothes, shoes. They didn't fit. They got punished and whipped for altering their shoes. They were saying that the shoes didn't even fit. They would be too big or too small, maybe both. Page 16, he talks about a cold curiosity. I thought this was an interesting word to use here, because he talks about how cold curiosity predominated even in Auschwitz, somehow detaching the mind from its surroundings, which came to be regarded with a kind of objectivity. He talks about what he means by this a little bit, about when he was on a climbing expedition and he got in an accident. He said he felt a sensation at the critical moment, curiosity as to whether I should come out of it alive or with a fractured skull or with some other injuries. Wow. So maybe he felt the same thing in the camp as well, like a curiosity. Am I going to make it out of here? What's going to happen to me? Am I going to have enough to eat today? And he says there at the end of page 16, we were anxious to know what would happen next and what would be the consequence, for example, of our standing in the open air in the chill of late autumn, stark naked, still wet from the showers. In the next few days, our curiosity evolved into surprise that we did not catch cold. So that's very interesting. He talks about how, his life, this whole notion of textbooks tell lies. Textbooks tell lies. And what he kind of meant by that was, and this was not something that he said, the medical men among us learned first of all textbooks tell lies. Somewhere it is said a man cannot exist without sleep for more than a stated number of hours. Quite wrong, he says. There was a lot of things that the human body can endure, but we never push ourselves to that because we do live in comfort. We live in a lot of comfort. We're not testing our body like it was tested here in the camps. So he was saying a lot of the textbooks would tell you like, oh, you need like vitamins, you need a certain amount of food a day or else you won't survive. Well, a lot of these prisoners proved these textbooks wrong. Yes, a lot of them died because of these things, but they were proven wrong. There was people who survived even through the sleep deprivation, the conditions, the cold, the food scarcity. People made it through. He says even with the severe vitamin deficiency, they had healthier gums than ever before. Yes, they got frostbite, but sores and abrasions did not suppurate. I'm actually going to... What does suppurate even mean? Suppurate, undergo the formation of pus, fester. Yeah, it didn't happen. Didn't happen. Another instance, a light sleeper who used to be disturbed by the slightest noise now found himself lying pressed against a comrade who snored loudly and yet slept quite soundly through the night. So the human body can endure a lot. It can endure a lot like they endured. Sleep deprivation. It can endure vitamin deficiency. I mean, even calorie deficiency, long-term cold, etc. A lot of things. Page 18. Even throughout all of this that we've just described, this is like almost still day one stuff in the camp, because he says that we were still in the first phase of our psychological reactions. So remember what the first phase was? That shock phase? When you're in the camp for the first time, that's the first phase. Suicide entered the minds, he was saying. It was born of the hopelessness of the situation, the constant danger of death looming over us. But Victor said that he promised he would not commit suicide. Then the most common way to commit suicide was running into the wire, meaning the electric fence, basically, that surrounded the camp. People would just run into it. Wow, I can't imagine that. Here he mentions a guy, Dostoevsky's statement that flatly defines a man as being one who can get used to anything. And I meant to look up who I don't think it's Fyodor. Maybe. Yes. I believe it was... Oh, maybe not. Oh, sorry, guys. I was trying to figure out who Dostoevsky was. I don't think he's talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky, the author, because he spells the name a little wrong here. And I'm looking at first paragraph of page 18 of my edition. Page 19, we're given some advice. Victor's given some advice on page 19. And this kind of is what I'm talking about earlier about those two lines. So a guy comes into his block and he's saying, he's giving some, as Victor describes, he gave us a few hurried tips. One thing I beg of you, he continued, shave daily if at all possible, even if you have to use a piece of glass to do it. Wow. I couldn't imagine shaving with a piece of glass. I mean, could you? Why did they do this? So you could look younger, and scraping will make your cheeks look ruddier. There's only one way to stay alive. If you want to stay alive, there's only one way. Look fit for work. Don't limp. Don't appear injured. Don't limp. Because at that point, they won't have any use for you. They can just get another person in there. Why spend time rehabbing this one person, the time and the resources? They'll just get somebody else. And they do not care about you. You will be gassed. You will be gassed. So think about that even if you are injured, having to push through that. Just to keep working for no pay, just to keep staying alive. Here's a word. He says a Moslem. M-O-S-L-E-M, which meant a man who looks miserable, down and out, sick, and emaciated. Sick and emaciated. You did not want to look like that. You did not want to look like a Moslem. Then this guy on page 20 says, oh, you guys have nothing to fear. I'm paraphrasing here. All you have to do, you guys have nothing to fear. The only person here who kind of looks like that is this guy, and he points to Victor, and they get kind of a laugh about it. And I do wonder if there was any sort of like humor in these camps that like could kind of like be used as a form to take the pain away of what was really happening, or give your mind a mental break from the anguish that is happening to you here. Continuing on with page 20, another quote here I think that deserves a little bit of attention is Lessing, who once said that there are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose. And another way Viktor Frankl explains this is that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Right? So it's totally the thoughts of suicide, what was that term that we talked about? Delusion of reprieve on page 10. These are things that are normal in an abnormal situation. However, here's where he now talks about the second phase. Of those three phases, now they are deeply entrenched in camp. So all of a sudden, normal behavior, there are no more abnormal reactions. situations are normal. I'm just typing this out for you guys. Abnormal reactions to abnormal situations are normal. But then once you reach that second phase, now you're in the apathy phase. You're in the emotional death phase, as Victor calls it. Here, all of a sudden, you become normalized to everything around you. So it's not weird to see people hanging, weird to see people with frostbitten feet dying, people whipping, Nazis whipping these prisoners. That's all normal. Now you're in the second phase. You're deeply entrenched in the camp. And that's a perfect word to describe the second phase. Is apathy. Apathy, emotional death. He's going to talk about how, let me see if I can find it here. How people would look away from people being beaten. They couldn't stand the sight of it. But now, as he says here on page 21, people did not avert. But the prisoner who had passed into the second stage of his psychological reactions did not avert his eyes anymore. His feelings were blunted. That's another good word to describe that. Blunted. They literally beat those normalized reactions out of you. They were hastened, as he says, and thus the mortification of normal reactions was hastened. Let's continue on to page 22. Again, sites were so commonplace that they did not move people anymore. People didn't, I don't know if they didn't care. I don't know if that's the right word, that they didn't care. They just didn't feel anything for it. They were numb to it. That's another good word for that second phase, maybe. Numb to it. Even when you were beaten, you were insensitive to the daily and hourly beatings he talks about. It got to a point where physically it did not hurt. This is end of page 23 here. Only thus did I spot the guard of my sign who was using his stick. At such a moment, it is not the physical pain which hurts the most. It's the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. Continuing on and building off that, a blow which does not even find its mark can, under certain circumstances, hurt more than one that finds its mark. And I am going to, this was on page 24. Find its mark can hurt more. So what does he really mean by that? Talks about how there's this story, the rock throwing story here on page 24, where he talks about how he was working, mending a track, and then for a moment he paused to get his breath. He leaned on his shovel, and one of the soldiers, one of the guards, thought that he was loafing or taking a break. And instead of going over there yelling at his number, yelling at him just personally, maybe not even any regard for his number or not saying his number in order to identify him, all he did was just throw a rock. He threw a rock at him, picked up a stone and threw it at me. And he said to me that seemed like a way to attract the attention of a beast or call an animal back to its job. The guard did not think it was worth it, did not think it worth his while to say anything, not even a swear word, to the ragged, emaciated figure standing before him. Here's a story on page 25 where he kind of talks back to somebody. There was a foreman. So I'm going to distinguish this because I believe it's funny because he calls him a pig. But it's not an SS soldier. It's not a Nazi, but it's a foreman. Yeah, along came a foreman with chubby, rosy cheeks, and he was berating him. And he calls him, "You pig, I've been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you how to work." And Victor kind of stands up to him in a way. Kind of talks back to him in a way. And I'm not sure why this really got to Victor this moment in time, because I'm sure he's been beaten. He's been called the worst of names before, but something about this guy that comes up to him, this foreman, I don't even know if he was a part of the guards, comes up to him, gives him all this trouble. "You pig, I've been watching you. I'll teach you how to work. You must have been a businessman in your previous life." Victor says, "I was past caring, but I had to take this threat of killing me seriously, so I straightened up and looked him directly in the eye. I was a doctor, a specialist." And the guy's like, "What? A doctor? I bet you got a lot of money out of people." Victor, and I quote, "As it happens, I did most of my work for no money at all in the clinics for the poor, but now I had said too much." And he was knocked down. He was shouted at like a madman. He didn't even know what he was, what words were being shouted at him. I wanted to show in this apparently trivial story that there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner. Indignation not about cruelty or pain, but about the insult connected with it. Because this man, this is going to continue a little bit on page 26. This man, according to Victor, had so, and this is true too. I'm not saying like according to Victor, in that somebody else would think differently, but just on his account, this man who had so little idea of it, a man who looks so vulgar. Basically, he didn't like the idea that this guy was judging him when he didn't even know him. Think about that. You think about this like big guy, probably well-fed. He said he looked like a pig. He really did. I believe that's what he says. He really did look like a pig. He looked so vulgar, is what Victor says. But you got this guy saying, "You guys aren't even working that hard," knowing that they're malnourished, can't sleep, it's cold outside. This guy was wearing warm gloves. He's fattened up. You know, he's got the energy to yell around and stuff, but he has the gall to tell them, "Hey, you need to work. You're not working hard enough. Do you know what we are going through?" Is kind of what Victor, I'm sure Victor was feeling. Where do you have the authority to judge us on that? And maybe because this was a foreman, I don't know if this gentleman was necessarily part of the Nazis, and if he was, if Victor would have talked back to him in the same manner if he was a Nazi. Or maybe he was both. And I don't know. That's another distinction here between foreman. Is a foreman a part of a Nazi, SS, etc.? Let's continue on. Victor was saved a little bit by this situation, though. He had befriended a capo, who again, as I mentioned earlier, these were prisoners with special privileges, did the dirty work for the Nazis. He befriended this capo by lending him an ear, letting him talk to him about his relationship, matrimonial troubles. Victor gave him psychotherapeutic advice. And for this, Victor got some special treatment in some ways. He was allowed to march at the beginning of the line, towards the front of the line versus the back, which had its advantages. If you were towards the front, or if you were towards the back and people like fell, tripped up, your whole area of that line, substring of that line, could be then tripped up as well. They had to wait for everybody to get back up, get back in that straight line. I'm assuming you had like an assigned spot, and then you had to play catch up to get back to the line that you were disconnected from. Oftentimes it was cold. You had to run on feet that were super cold. Not fun. You had to run on like injured limbs potentially. So basically it was good that he was towards the front of the line. And this capo actually got him, I'm trying to find it. I think it's on page 27 here. He managed to save my life. The day after the episode with the foreman, he smuggled me into another work party. Potentially saved his life, because who knows? Next thing you know, he's coming in. If Victor comes into work next day after that incident, the foreman is having a bad day. Maybe it does not go well for Victor. Maybe it does not go well for Victor in the next day, because he was probably on a short leash at that point. Page 28, he talks about, again, apathy. The main symptom of the second phase was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow became the central task while you were here. This task of just staying alive, it is narrowed down to this one single task. That's all you are trying to do every single day. You're not trying to wake up early for work. You don't have your kids around, your wife, your parents. There's no book club. There's no club. There's no athletic things. There's no seeing your friends. You are just worried about getting to the next day. And he talks about this sort of like caused a regression in the camp inmate, a retreat to a more primitive form of mental life. He talks about dreams, how people would dream about getting out, bread, cake, cigarettes, nice warm baths. They would dream about these things, and Victor kind of questions if the dreams did any good. I'm going to pose this question to you guys. Would dreaming of getting out do any good for you if you were a prisoner? Right? What would it do anything for you? Now, this was an interesting story. He told about a fellow prisoner who was asleep and was having a horrible nightmare. I'm guessing that he probably heard the guy moaning, groaning in his sleep, having like a night terror of sorts. And Victor wanted to wake him up, but he didn't, because he said, no matter how horrible, that dream could not be as bad as the reality of the camp. So he didn't wake him. No matter how bad that dream is, nothing is worse than the reality that you're about to wake up to. So he did not wake him up. Wow. That is, that truth cuts deep. Truth cuts very deep. And now we're on to the last page here, page 30. This is where Victor introduces a word here on page 30. He introduces a word here on page 30 where he starts to refer to him and his fellow prisoners and himself as an organism. It is now wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies. It's the organism that digested its own protein and started to regress. And I'm guessing they're in this camp for so long that they've been stripped of all their belongings. They don't have any hair on their body. They have lost tons of weight, sleep deprived, vitamin deficient. They've lost what it is to be. They're told what to do. They're beaten up. They've lost the meaning of what it is to be a human. And maybe that's why he starts to refer to this organism word. Wow. That is where we are going to leave off right here, page 30. And I'm going to pose this question. Why do you think starts referring to this word? Because he doesn't do this, obviously, in the beginning, right? He doesn't do it in the beginning, but eventually he does finally use this word later on in this chapter, but not in the beginning. In the beginning, they're still clinging on to that delusion of reprieve, maybe. They still feel human, but now they've been beaten. Victor was beaten by this pig, not getting enough sleep. Maybe it's because they no longer feel like human beings. They no longer feel like a man, like a human being. Guys, thank you very much for listening. I have these questions here, which maybe I can post in like a description on YouTube. But these are just some questions to think about. And maybe I'll make another video discussing some of these questions before we move on to the next few pages. I think the next pages we'll do from page 31 to through 50. 31 through 50 we'll do next. So we'll make it a little bit shorter this time. A little bit shorter. Thank you guys very much for listening, and I will see you next time. If you have any questions, let me know, and see if you can answer some of these questions. Take care.